The Rules Committee will come to order. Today, we're considering two measures. The first is HR 1629, an uncontroversial and bipartisan bill to close a loophole in the Orphan Drug Act that has delayed treatments to combat the opiate epidemic. Last Congress, the bill passed by voice vote, but last week, some of my Republican colleagues threw a temper tantrum on the House floor and voted against the bill because one of their members was not named a leader on the bill. I think that's an example of pettiness, quite frankly, and it put politics before helping those dealing with addiction. So enough of that. We should put people's lives before our own egos, and I hope that we can end the games and pass finally this bill. Second, we'll consider HRes 275, a resolution that condemns the recent horrific shootings in Atlanta, Georgia. Since the start of this pandemic, nearly 1 in 3 Asian Americans has reported experiencing racial slurs or jokes. Hate and intolerance has no place in our country. We need to put this House on record as making it clear that anti-Asian sentiment and expressions of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination should not and will not be tolerated. Now I'm happy to turn to our ranking member for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today's hearing, as you said, covers 2 items. The first I'll discuss is HRes 275, a resolution condemning the horrific shootings in Atlanta in March and reaffirming the House of Representatives' commitment to combating hate, bigotry, and violence against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Certainly, these are sentiments that all members share. All members condemn such violence, and all members condemn hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I understand that the Republicans on the Oversight Committee have identified areas in this legislation that cause some concern, and I'm interested to hear their thoughts during today's proceedings. I am disappointed that this resolution did not receive committee consideration, even though the Oversight Committee held a markup of many other pieces of legislation just last week. When we circumvent the committee process, all too often the result is a more partisan product than is needed and a missed opportunity for the House of Representatives to speak with a unified voice. Frankly, I do not see any reason why any concerns that the members may have over provisions of this resolution could not have been addressed. And certainly there was an opportunity even this past week to do so. This bill could then be put on the suspension calendar rather than coming to the Rules Committee. Our second item is the one that will be familiar to all members, HR 1629, the Fairness and Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act, which originally came to the floor last week, but failed to meet the 2/3 majority required to pass on suspension. I expect that when this bill comes up for a vote this week, it will pass overwhelmingly, as it should. The reason so many members voted against the bill had nothing to do with the language of the bill. Said it had everything to do with how the majority's chosen to run the institution for the last year. Unfortunately, the decisions made by the majority at the beginning of the COVID pandemic continue to haunt us. Last spring, I warned that the decision to allow proxy voting and allow for remote committee hearings would inevitably lead to consequences in how the institution operates. Conflicts between members that have emerged in the new Congress are undoubtedly exacerbated by decisions made to shut down the institution and work in a remote capacity for a full year. Sadly, it's much easier to yell at a colleague through a screen than to do it in person. This week marks 1 year since the Democratic majority instituted martial law, which has given the majority the right to bring up any piece of legislation at any time with only an hour notice. I grant you that this made sense when it was initially instituted. In the midst of a deadly pandemic where flexibility and timeliness were key to the emergency federal response. But here we are 367 days later with nearly 60% of the adults in the country vaccinated with their first dose. I'd like to remind my good friend, the chairman, of his outrage when a Republican majority used martial law for just 3 days. You said at the time, quote, "This rule would allow Republican leadership to rush anything to the floor within hours of it being released, not just appropriations. It gives them blanket authority to jam us with whatever new disaster they cook up with the White House in the back room of the Capitol," unquote. And I would say to my friend that if that was true for us then, it's certainly true for the majority now. With all due respect, you're now presiding over the most closed Congress in history term we've all used a great deal. Here we are 1 year since the start of the pandemic, and the Pelosi lockdown continues. The majority's already taken away the traditional right of the minority to offer a motion to recommit, and has threatened to reduce the ability of members to make even the most privileged parliamentary motions. This committee will not even allow for standalone votes on most amendments, instead lumping them into predetermined groups to guarantee their outcome. And the speaker's unwilling to let her own iron-fisted grip to loosen, even as the country has begun to reopen. Just last week, the CDC issued guidance allowing fully vaccinated people to resume most activities without a mask, but the speaker has set a 100% requirement to consider removal of a unilateral mask mandate on the people's house. What happened to following the science? Should we trust that these vaccines are effective or not? Because if they are, and I do believe they are, it makes no sense to continue this mask mandate, and we should reconsider that. Given all of this, the only tool the minority has left is to register our discontent by using our voting cards. And so this leads to a situation like we're in with this bill, where the minority is left with no recourse but to use its voting power to send a message to the majority and to the speaker. If we are to move forward as an institution, we must take steps toward restoring the basic norms we adhered to for decades, but that have eroded over the past year. This includes matters related to the COVID pandemic, like moving away from proxy voting and moving back to in-person committee hearings. I hope we can work toward that, Mr. Chairman. But it also means ensuring that members continue to work with each other as they have before. At the end of the day, we're all blessed to be chosen delegates whom our constituents have entrusted to represent them in Congress. So long as any member is doing what they think best represents their district, we should continue to embrace them. Above all, we should continue to work together to make laws that will improve the lives of Americans. HR 1629 is one such bill, and I look forward to its quick passage. I'm hopeful we'll soon find ways to work together as we once did. With that, Mr. Speaker, well, it wouldn't bother me, but Mr. Chairman, I know it might bother you. I know you're too modest to accept the promotion, but some days I think you deserve it. But anyway, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just want to just say a couple of things in response. We all want to get back to normal, and I think what we're doing is we're following the advice of the Capitol physician, and I think the easiest way for us to get back to normal is for all members to get vaccinated. I'm told, according to CNN, all Democrats in the House have been vaccinated. They say that just 95 House Republicans say that they were vaccinated. So again, let's all get vaccinated, and then everything else will fall into place. And then I want to take a little bit of an issue with the gentleman's characterization of this as being the most closed Congress. I'm looking at my statistics, and so we've had 14 closed rules right now, and at the same time in the 115th Congress, you guys had 31. So I don't know. I wasn't a whiz in arithmetic, but we're substantially short of the number of closed rules during the same period of time as my friends were in the 115th Congress. So I just want to point that out for the record. And then on the issue of the suspension that failed, my understanding was that the issue that caused Mr. Carter to lobby Republicans to vote no on it was the fact that he wasn't the lead Republican sponsor. Nothing more than that. And again, to try to hold up a bill on an issue that's important over something like that, again, it has nothing to do with remote hearings. I think that the deal is that the sponsor of this bill, Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania, was quite upset that Mr. Carter voted to basically try to overturn the will of the people of Pennsylvania in the last election. And I think a lot of us are having trouble with some of that. But in any event, I am now happy to welcome Our witnesses, we're going to begin with witnesses to provide testimony in HR 1629, the Fairness in Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act. Chairman Pallone and Subcommittee Ranking Member Latta, we're delighted that you're here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of the hearing will be entered into the record. I'm now happy to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and members of the committee. I don't want to belabor this issue about what happened last week because I'm not sure I entirely know. But I do want you to know that, as you are aware, of course, that we can't have everything come before the Rules Committee because otherwise legislation that comes out of committee, in my case, Energy and Commerce, that both sides agree to would be, would take forever. I mean, we had last week, I think, a dozen or so bills on suspension. A few weeks before that, we had another 12. And so I just want you to understand that so there's no question about two things. One is that, the minority leader agreed with our majority leader to put this on the suspension calendar. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been on. And also that the manager on the Republican side, Mr. Guthrie, who's the Health Subcommittee ranking member, it came out of the Health Subcommittee, he also supported the bill and indicated his support on the floor. And he he spoke out when we had the voice vote and said aye. So I was very much taken aback when the minority leader and Mr. Guthrie subsequently called for a vote and then voted against it. So all I'm trying to say is, whatever the reason, I think you're right, Chairman, that this was about the sponsorship on the Republican side. But whatever the reason, we can't have a situation where we put something on the suspension list because the Republican leader agrees to it and the person who manages the bill agrees to it, and then they change their mind. I mean, everybody's entitled to change their mind, but that's not a fair way to proceed because then we wouldn't have put it on the suspension list from the beginning. So that's the only thing I'm trying to say. I don't want to keep belaboring this. But in any case, the bill HR 1629, the Fairness in Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act, closes a loophole in the orphan drug program to ensure generic drugs can come to market and are not unfairly blocked by their brand competitors. I'm going to try to explain to this, but I want you to know this can be very complicated. So if at any point you say, what are you talking about, Frank? You can interrupt me and ask questions before I conclude. But the goal with the orphan drug legislation in the beginning was to try to deal with companies that want to develop a drug, but it's not in wide use because it's only for a very limited group. And oftentimes they say, well, I have no reason to develop that in our capitalist system if I can't make any money. And so we tried to figure out years ago when we passed this bill a way to bring those drugs to market because it's important for the people that have those diseases, even though they may be very limited, that these drugs be developed. But there are loopholes that have been created that cause problems and make it more difficult to bring generics to market. So that's basically what we're trying to do. In any case, the bill passed the Energy and Commerce Committee and the House by voice vote last Congress. It garnered a lot of support from a large majority in the House last week. And as I said, it seeks to address two crises: the soaring cost of prescription drugs and the ongoing opioid crisis. The Orphan Drug Act, as I said, has been successful in driving research and discovery of new therapies to treat and even cure diseases. And we incentivize these therapies for this limited group of diseases by awarding 7 years of market exclusivity. Normally, you wouldn't get 7 years, but we give you extra years because we know that it's a limited group and that's otherwise you're not going to make any money. So there's two ways to get this orphan drug status and this 7 years exclusivity. Under the first pathway, the status can be awarded when a manufacturer develops drugs approved to treat diseases with a patient population of 200,000 or fewer. But the second pathway, though rarely used, is what we call a cost recovery pathway, where they receive this status if the research and development costs are not expected to be recouped by sales of the underlying drug, okay? So under certain circumstances, though, a manufacturer may also receive additional rounds of exclusivity for additional drugs in their portfolio if they treat the same condition and have the same active ingredient, even if the second drug does not meet the orphan drug qualifications. So this has allowed some manufacturers to circumvent the original intent of the drug, which was to incentivize the creation of these novel drugs for small populations. Now I'm going to veer from my text a little bit and try to be a little more, I don't know which one is it, so that I can explain this. Let's say that I don't want to go the first pathway because I don't know about that 200,000. I can go before the FDA and I can say, look, I don't think I'm going to make any money on this drug unless you give me this exclusive status. Well, right now under the law, if you do that, then you can say that you're not going to recover the cost, and it's up to the FDA to decide whether or not you're not going to recoup it. So one of the things that we do here is to switch the burden, if you will, and say in this bill that it's up to you to prove that you're not going to recoup the money, not the FDA. So that's the one thing. The second thing that we do is that if down the road, 3, 4, 5 years later, right, during this exclusivity period, you find another use for this same drug, right, and you now want to continue with this orphan drug status for the 7 years, but for a different use, for a different disease, a different purpose. Well, right now you can do that and continue to make $1 million and not have to go back. And of course, because it's exclusive for this period, there's no generic that comes to market, and may be very unaffordable for people. So what we say in this bill is that no, if you find a second use for this drug, you have to come back again and once again show that you can't recoup the money, right? So you just can't go off and make $1 billion and have this exclusive period. Now, I don't know if that helps, but what I'm trying to say is that it shouldn't be that a person who gets the status initially, then finds another use for it, continues to be able to sell it and make billions of dollars with this exclusivity, because that prevents the generic from coming to market unfairly. So, I mean, essentially that's it. Now, let me give you an example of what happened, because this is an example and then I'll stop, okay? The best example was what we call bupe, okay? I don't know if you know what bupe is, but this is the drug, if people are having an overdose and they give it to them and then they recover without, dying of an overdose. Oftentimes the police or EMTs will deliver that. No, I have a wrong understanding. Okay, well, maybe I've misunderstood what bupe is about. But what happened with bupe is that they got the orphan drug status, right? And then later they found a different way of using it. And that resulted in billions of dollars of sales without their having to come back and prove again for that follow-on use that that they needed the orphan drug status. And that's what we don't want to do. It's not fair to give this status to someone because they do some kind of a follow-on and find out it has another use that can make a lot more money and not have to come back again and ask for the orphan drug status. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe forget what I said about bupe because I didn't quite understand it. But the idea of what they did with the follow-on is clear, and I'll leave it at that. Everybody's laughing. It's complicated. That's why I wish that we had just passed it last week instead of having all this.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. That's more than
With all due respect to my friend, you're making the case why we should be looking at this more closely if even the chairman's confused about it.
Well, I'm not saying it's confusing.
That was meant in jest, Mr. Chairman.
What we're trying to do is prevent somebody from using this exclusive period to make a lot of money when that wasn't the premise behind why they were supposed to get it. You got it. You understand.
Got it.
All right.
Set here. Good. All right. Ranking Member Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to my leader on the from the Rules Committee, and also to my friend from New Jersey, the Chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm not going to go into the detail because I think the Chairman covered it quite well. But HR 1629, the Fairness and Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act, will close that loophole in existing law that has allowed certain drug manufacturers to block competitors from the market by exploiting incentives intended to encourage the development of drugs to treat rare diseases. And again, as was pointed out, this bill was led by a number of Republicans and Democrats in the last Congress, and I see no reason why it should be any different in this Congress. And with that, I urge the Rules Committee to act favorably on 1629, and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You both were clear and succinct, and I'm on board, so I have no questions. Mr. Cole?
Well, I certainly agree with the chairman. You were clear and succinct, and I look forward to voting for the bill. I do want to make one quick point to my friend, the chairman, Energy and Commerce. Just so you know, I actually had a bill about 3 years ago, and it dealt with moving 2.5 acres of land from federal possession to a water conservancy. Suspension bill, not supposed to be any problem. Guy actually flew up from the area in Oklahoma that he's from. And there was some, I don't even remember what it was. There was some difference of opinion over some totally unrelated item. And all my friends on the other side decided to vote no and took down my suspension bill. At least in this case, it actually had something to do with the bill. In my case, absolutely had nothing to do with the bill. And it took me about another 6 or 8 months to get this thing worked out again, get it back up and get it done. And I say that just simply with, sometimes people lose their temper. I recognize that on all sides. And I do think our current situation, and it's more pandemic related than anything else, probably exacerbates that. So maybe we ought to sit back and take a deep breath. But the legislation's good. It certainly is going to get enormous bipartisan support. And, hopefully we can avoid these kind of incidents going forward. But having been the victim of one, I know both sides do it. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, one side does and one side doesn't. But I've had this happen to my legislation before as well. So, again, I'm sympathetic to your remarks, but having been the victim, perhaps less sympathetic that it's somehow, doesn't occur on both sides, because it does. With that, Mr. Chairman, I have no questions. Look forward to supporting the legislation. Yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone on the Democratic side have any questions? Ms. Scanlon?
Yes, thank you. Chairman Pallone, I just wanted to clarify. My understanding on this bill is that it closes a loophole that could be used to block certain drugs, and that the issue arose in connection with buprenorphine, which, unlike Narcan, which can bring someone back from
I was wrong about that, and I apologize. I was just explaining to me that I was really talking about Narcan. Bup is the one that is when people to treat people with addiction.
Right, and it's very important in the medically assisted treatment, MAT movement, which,
yes,
Pennsylvania has a terrible problem with opioid disorders. So we have a lot of advocates who are very anxious to be able to use this and to be able to use it at a price that can be met. So this bill would address all of these issues. I just also wanted to clarify, in fact, this bill was introduced with bipartisan support, maybe not Mr. Carter, but there in fact was a Republican on introduction of the bill, wasn't there?
Yes, and remember, this passed in the last Congress on the suspension calendar too. So this is the second time it's coming around.
And it didn't squeak through, even when it failed last week. It failed the suspension 2/3 threshold, but it was 250 to 168, so it has broad bipartisan support.
Yes.
Yeah. It's been tough, particularly for members of Congress from Pennsylvania, to see our electoral results attacked without any factual basis. And many of us have struggled with how to work in a bipartisan manner with members who are not observing constitutional norms. So, but we also recognize that we have to do things to support our constituents and to try to get laws passed. So I will be really looking forward to supporting passage of this bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Anybody on the Republican side, Mr. Burgess or any, Ms. Fishbach? No? Let me just,
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I was a little slow on the unmute.
Okay.
I've supported this bill in the past, look forward to supporting it in the future when it comes back to the floor. But I do encourage, people need to talk to each other and not just freeze people out. This is not we're the people's house. We're supposed to be working together. And the fact that we're not is personally disconcerting to me. But again, I recognize what's going on here. We will have the bill back on the floor. I expect to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Have it? Nobody else? Okay, then, seeing nobody else, then I would like to thank our witnesses for your testimony, and you're now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
So are there any members who wish to testify on HR 1629? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on HR 1629. HRes 2275, the condemning the horrific shootings in Atlanta, Georgia on March 16th, 2021, and reaffirming the House of Representatives' commitment to combating hate, bigotry, and violence against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I would now like to call up our next panel to testify on HRes 275. That Representative DeSaulnier and Representative Fallon. We're delighted that you are here. Although Mr. DeSaulnier, you're always here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. And I now am happy to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. It's an honor to be on this side of the camera, so to speak. And this is an important resolution. Looking forward to widespread support from my good friend and colleague, our colleague, Judy Chu. Again, thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the Rules Committee for the opportunity to testify on House Resolution 275. This resolution condemns the horrific shootings in Atlanta, Georgia on March 16. On that tragic day, a shooter murdered 8 Americans and injured 1 other in 3 separate shootings that took place at Asian-owned spas. Of the 8 Americans who lost their lives, 7 were women, 6 were women of Asian descent, and 7 were immigrants. We mourn these victims, and our hearts go out to their families and friends that they've left behind. This act of hate was not, unfortunately, an isolated incident. Anti-Asian sentiment in America existed long before the pandemic, but over the past year, our nation has experienced a historic surge in anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian hate crimes. Asian Americans across the country have faced discrimination, harassment, and assault because of xenophobia and misinformation that has scapegoated them for the coronavirus pandemic. Asian American women have been particularly vulnerable. 65% of anti-Asian hate incidents have been reported by women, a population that has been historically marginalized. According to a recent report for the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, the number of anti-Asian hate crimes reported to the police in San Francisco increased by 50% in the past year. In Boston, the number of anti-Asian hate crimes reported increased by 133% last year. And these numbers are only increasing. Anti-Asian hate crimes reported to the police in 16 of America's largest cities and counties rose 164% in the first quarter of 2021 in comparison to the same period in 2020. The House of Representatives should clearly state our condemnation of the heinous and inexcusable acts of gun violence that led to the tragic loss of lives in Georgia on March 16th. We have proudly passed the Bipartisan Background Checks Act and Enhanced Background Checks Act in the House this year, but we need to see these bills passed into law and more meaningful gun violence reforms to take guns out of the hands of people who are a danger to themselves and to others. Importantly, the House should also unequivocally disavow any racism or sexism that contributed to the targeting of Asian-owned businesses. This resolution honors the memory of the victims and the loved ones they leave behind. The healing process will be long and difficult for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and all communities impacted by these tragedies. Importantly, the resolution affirms the commitment of the federal government to combat hate, combat bigotry, and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and to prevent tragedies like this in the future. I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know we recognize Representative Fallon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm a native from Massachusetts, incidentally, Pittsfield.
Oh,
20 years of my life.
yeah, that's great. I can tell by your accent. Yeah.
Go Sox. It's an honor to testify before the committee. I would agree with my colleague that the killing of innocent people is always a tragedy. We all know that. We always have. On March 16th, 2021, the 8 souls were lost in Atlanta. And that's no different. It's an unconscionable act of senseless violence, and we grieve with the victims' families and their friends and their loved ones that have to cope with this tremendous loss. It's just beyond the pale. It's atrocious, and justice must prevail, and the perpetrator must be held to account for these murders. While our prayers are with the innocent victims, and this should be universally condemned, unfortunately, this resolution is selective. It comes to the floor under a rule when it was not even marked up at the committee process, at the committee level. If this issue was so important, members should have been allowed to offer amendments through the proper committee process, which might have softened some of, perhaps could be construed as partisan nature of this resolution as it comes to the floor. But unfortunately, our friends across the aisle apparently, it seems it smacks that perhaps this is not the intent to get universal support. If our friends across the aisle were really interested in condemning racial bias in an even-handed way, that they would not have constructed this resolution in the form it appears before us today. Instead, we should be voting on a much simpler statement opposing racial bias, but we're not. But here we are, and my remark will focus on the inherently biased structure of the resolution before us. This resolution dismisses the rule of law. Let me explain. It does this by assuming facts in an individual case that hasn't yet to be proven. The trial hasn't finished. The trial hasn't even begun yet. And there's no question that the shootings in Atlanta are horrific. But the motivation has yet to be determined under law. And there is evidence to the effect that these murders, and they're grotesque, but were motivated by something other than race. And while all illegal violence should be roundly condemned, it is inappropriate for the House of Representatives to opine on the facts of an individual case when those facts will be decided by an impaneled jury, and that jury will hear all the evidence. A jury should not be pressured into deciding the facts one way or the other based on political spin or partisan pressure directed by our chamber. One member of this House has already done great damage to the idea of due process under the law by publicly stating protesters should get more confrontational if the jury in another case declined to convict. Those irresponsible and inflammatory statements led the judge, in that case, the judge, not anybody in DC, to say to the defense lawyer that I'll give you that, but the Congresswoman may have given somebody a means to appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned. Do we really want to increase the likelihood of that happening in the case involving the Atlanta shooting? This resolution could set such a precedent. This is a reckless path to embark down for such an important legislative body. But this resolution does not just risk unhelpful courtroom drama, it also smacks of political theater. The partisan nature of this effort is being made clear by what was left on the cutting room floor. So do our House Democratic friends, why did they edit out the resolution addressing anti-Asian bias? House Democrats have left out the many ongoing and high-profile lawsuits filed by Asian Americans alleging anti-Asian discrimination in schools and university admissions policies. Why are House Democrats ignoring those allegations in this resolution? And what does this resolution include? It includes the strange statement that the reference to the Wuhan virus is anti-Asian when viruses have been routinely referred to by their place of origin. West Nile virus is named after the West Nile district of Uganda. Zika was named after the Zika forest in Uganda. Ebola was named after the Ebola River in Zaire in Central Africa. Here in America, the Rocky Mountain spotted fever is named after the mountain range spreading across the western North America. And Lyme's disease, Mr. Chairman, in our native New England, was named after the disease outbreak in Lyme, Connecticut. Are we talking about now that's going to be geographical prejudice? Where were the resolutions condemning the use of Ebola, Zika, or West Nile? Not only have we not seen resolutions condemning these names, they have been embodied in the United States Code many times in reference to the very disease they combat. MERS is another one, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. There's also variants in the UK variant of COVID-19, South African variant, et cetera. I could go on, but the point's made. This resolution goes from the shaky to the politically selective, and now with this thing about the Wuhan being racist to the absurd. The result is an allegedly anti-bias resolution that only succeeds in selectively citing bias in a politically biased way. I'll close with a statement of principle that no House resolution can come close to matching in its compelling moral clarity. It is a statement of the revered great American, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "I have a dream my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Asian Americans have demonstrated great character with their countless contributions to the American experiment. The most successful, when you break this down demographically by race, the most successful economic group is our Asian American brothers and sisters. We should be focused on allowing due process here to play out and continue to condemn such vile and evil acts of violence against any and all Americans. We all, every one of us, 435 members of this chamber, mourn the victims of this attack, including the family members of the community they have left behind. And I join my colleagues in seeking the fullest expression of justice that our system is designed to deliver. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just want to say that, Mr. Fallon, that, I think the concern about the way this virus was characterized intensified because the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans intensified with the rhetoric. I would hope you don't think referring to COVID-19 as Kung Flu is appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's disgusting.
Yeah, well, but that's in the bill. That's one of the references about how this virus was characterized. And in any event, I appreciate you being here, but I think this is a serious matter that we need to be clear on, and so I look forward to supporting this. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank both of our witnesses, and I certainly join both of our witnesses and every member of this panel in condemning violence and discriminatory behavior of any kind. There's simply no place for it, and certainly what happened in Atlanta was a horrific act of violence, whether it was, racial in nature, sexual in nature. We still have a legal process going through to try and determine that. But at the end of the day, people were murdered. And that's never acceptable, whatever the reason is. So we can have our discussion about that. But again, I want to thank our witnesses and certainly our panel member, our fellow Rules Committee member, and look forward to further discussion on what's an important issue that ought to bring us together and never ever pull us apart.
Thank you.
And I thank my friend from Texas as well, because I think he made some important points for us to also consider. With that, no questions, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate both witnesses for their testimony. Mr. Fallon, I'd like to just say thank you. I don't agree with the position that you end up coming out with, but I do appreciate the tone and tenor of your argument. Often we get a lot of rhetoric and noise and firebrand kind of deliveries up in the Rules Committee, and I appreciate it. This is a very serious and solemn piece of legislation, and it may be that you feel it could affect the outcome of the lawsuits or the criminal case or whatever. But I just wanted to say thanks for the way you delivered your position. And I don't agree with it, but I thank you for the way you delivered it. And I yield back.
Yeah, that's the Massachusetts in him. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask a question of both of our witnesses. Was there an actual hearing on the substance of this resolution in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee? Or was this discharged directly to the Rules Committee?
Mr. Burgess, my understanding, and I was not heard in the Oversight Committee, or was not.
Yeah, Doctor, we didn't discuss, to my knowledge, we did not discuss this resolution.
So, and again, I appreciate what our role is here at the Rules Committee, and we're to hear the things that are brought before us. I just wonder if some of the issues, Mr. Fallon, that you bring up might have been ameliorated if we'd even just had a discussion of the facts prior to bringing it to the Rules Committee. You know, there's a temptation always for us to comment on things when there may actually be ongoing litigation or an ongoing criminal trial. I remember many years ago, Richard Nixon gave an opinion about the guilt of Charles Manson, and darn near caused a mistrial in that effort. And the judge declined to declare a mistrial, but only after the president walked back very publicly his remarks that he had made about Charles Manson and reaffirmed the necessity of him receiving a fair and unbiased trial. So we need to be careful when we do things. We do have a bully pulpit up here. No question the crimes involved are horrific, and no one wants to see any type of that behavior ever repeated. But I do wonder if we wouldn't do a little bit better service to the people if we would do our work at the committee level before bringing it to the Rules Committee. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both of our witnesses, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would speak strongly in favor of this resolution. The country is really engulfed in waves of anti-Asian violence. I've seen it in my state. We've seen it in media around the country where senior citizens who are Asian American have been the victims of terrible hate crimes in metros, on the streets, in Chinese restaurants. And this is something that's affecting communities all across the land. So I'm glad that we've got this resolution deploring the murder of eight people in Atlanta, Georgia, 7 of whom were women and 6 of whom were Asian American women. I appreciate the statement by our colleague from Massachusetts/Texas, but you know, there's nothing in the resolution which commits on the question of whether this is a hate crime, but it simply opposes any racism or sexism that fueled this mass murder that took place. And it's certainly taking place in a climate and an environment of anti-Asian bigotry and prejudice and violence. So I think it's altogether appropriate that we're doing it. Obviously, our resolution is not specific evidence in any case of any crime, nor is it itself a criminal prosecution or indictment or conviction. That would be an unlawful bill of attainder. It's simply a statement of congressional concern and sentiment about the climate of racism and violence that's taking place in the country right now. And I think that's altogether appropriate and consistent with lots of resolutions that I think everybody in this room has supported in the past. And there's no reason that we should somehow carve out an exception and not do it for the Asian American community. So I would just like to ask Mr. Desaulniers, given that so many public officials have spoken out, including in my state, our governor, who's a Republican governor, Governor Hogan, who's married to an Asian American woman. But given that a lot of public officials have spoken out forcefully against what's taking place, has this had a positive effect? And do you know whether there's actually been an improved public safety in Asian American communities, with people taking a strong stand against this kind of hostility.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. I can speak particularly for the San Francisco Bay Area, where I live, which we have a very large Asian population, very diverse. There has been great comments and public demonstrations with great partnerships by electeds and average citizens getting out and condemning what's happened and this bias in general. So yes, I think your comment is well taken. There has been a lot of outspoken criticism and consistent with what we've heard today from everybody on this committee.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing this forward, and I yield back to you.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'd associate my remarks with the ranking member, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. Yes, I very much support this bill moving forward, or this resolution. We have a significant Asian American Pacific population in my district, and folks were really shaken by the incident in Atlanta and the follow-up incidents that have been occurring. The really dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. So we clearly need to speak out more strongly. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Fischbach.
Mr. Chair, no questions at this time. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
I have no questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Desagne, do you want to ask yourself anything?
You sound like a therapist. No, as another native of Massachusetts, I don't want to talk to myself.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I really want to thank Mr. Desagne for bringing this forward. If there's any question that it's important for us to speak out as a Congress, let me tell you the reactions of the Asian American constituents I have in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. We have a vibrant and large API community, and in response to the horrific killings in Atlanta, there was a vigil with more than 200 people on the Saturday after the killings. And the week before that, the Constitutional Law and Civil Rights Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee had more than 3 hours of hearings on API hate crimes. And it was so upsetting that I had to get up a couple times and get a tissue just because it was so moving to hear what had happened to people. And similar things have happened in my district. What was the most impactful to me, however, when I got home and went to that vigil, was how many of my constituents had watched what Congress had done for more than 3 hours in that Judiciary Committee, and how many people thanked me just for being a member of that committee and speaking out on their behalf. That shows the power of our influence, and it shows our obligation to stand up when something has happened to a community and been so hurtful, hateful, and wrong. And that's precisely what this resolution does. It's why I support it and why I commend the members for bringing it forward. I hope the entire House will vote in favor. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And I want to recognize the newest member of our committee, Congressman Neguse. I admit that I'm a little uneasy about giving Congressman Perlmutter more power by upping our Colorado contingent. But in all seriousness, Joe has been trying to get people involved in the political process and make government a force for good since his college days. And he's new to the committee today, and he's not a new face to any of us. And because he's been working side by side with many of our members on important issues that we all care about. And so, Joe, welcome to our dysfunctional family. We lovingly refer to this as the Addams family. And I'm looking forward to working with you more closely on the Rules Committee. All of us are, and getting your perspective and insight on the bills we consider. But at this point, I'd like to yield to you if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no particular questions regarding the legislation, but I will say I certainly support it and am very grateful that the legislation will be considered by the full House later this week. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'm very much looking forward to serving with all of you on this important committee and such a distinguished group of colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And of course, under your leadership, Chairman, I've long admired the bipartisan committee, if you will, that exists on the Rules Committee, as my predecessor, Governor Polis, implored me for years to join your distinguished ranks. And so I'm proud to be Ed Perlmutter's understudy on the Rules Committee and to serve with all of you. With that, I'll yield.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a remark?
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, I want to welcome our friend to the committee. It is maybe not quite as dysfunctional as the chairman likes to say. Actually, I would say it's entirely too functional when you're on the wrong end of a 9-4 vote split. But it gets its work done, and that's in large measure due to our chairman. I must say, on our side, our assumption was you were being brought on as the adult supervision for Mr. Perlmutter. So we welcome you. And and hope that you can occasionally restrain your enthusiastic colleague who constantly peppers me, Mr. Chairman, with texts during the course of our hearings if I happen to yawn or to in any way misbehave according to his very high standards. But it's good to have you on this committee, and I've had the good fortune of serving with a number of people from your state, including your governor, on this committee, and I've never seen anybody on this committee, including my good friend, Mr. Perlmutter, not from Colorado, not acquit themselves with great distinction and great decorum. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
All right. Well, does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, and you are now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, are there any other members who wish to testify on HRes 275? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on HRes 275. And before I yield to Mr. Cole, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement of administration policy in support of HR 1629. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon. You're on mute.
Yes,
There you go.
thank you. And just pulling up the very long motion. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant HR 1629, the Fairness in Orphan Drug Exclusivity Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides for consideration of HRes 275, condemning the horrific shootings in Atlanta, Georgia on March 16, 2021, and reaffirming the House of Representatives' commitment to combating hate, bigotry, and violence against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the resolution. The rule provides that the resolution shall be considered as read. The rule provides that House Resolution 398 is hereby adopted. The rule provides that House Resolution 188 agreed to March 8, 2021, as amended by HRes 330 agreed to April 20, 2021, is amended by striking May 2021 each place it appears and inserting in each instance July 1, 2021. Finally, the rule provides that at any time through the legislative day of Thursday, May 20, 2021, the Speaker may entertain motions offered by the Majority Leader or a designee that the House suspend the rules with respect to multiple measures that were the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative days of May 17th or 18th, 2021, on which the yeas and nays were ordered and further proceedings postponed. The chair shall put the question on any such motion without debate or intervening motion, and the ordering of the yeas and nays on postponed motions to suspend the rules with respect to such measures is vacated. I yield back.
You heard the motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Any discussion or amendment? Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just, and I'll try to move through these as quickly as I can. We just have a series of amendments, and to be, just to notify the committee ahead of time. They really don't relate to the substance of the two measures that we heard today. We don't have objections to those. This really relates to the continuing now year-long exercise of authority under martial law by the Speaker. So, Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee strike from the rule the sections amending HRes 188, except for those pertaining to the Speaker's approval of the journal, adjournment authority, and the Speaker's authority to appoint members to perform the duties of the chair. Mr. Chairman, we've officially hit the one-year mark with the Speaker maintaining continuous martial law authority over the House. While I concede many of these provisions made sense in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic last spring and into the summer, when flexibility may have been necessary to rapidly and safely pass provisions related to the pandemic and recovery, this is clearly no longer the case. The country's turned the corner with regards to the pandemic, and the CDC has advised that vaccinated people no longer need to wear a mask. At some point, the Democratic majority needs to trust the Biden administration and their own science. My amendment will still keep intact the typical provisions necessary for a long recess, while also allowing the House to return to regular order. This amendment does not prevent remote hearings and proxy voting from continuing for those who continue to have COVID concerns, but rather ensures the Speaker can no longer continue to trample on minority protection. Mr. Chairman, over the past few months, we've proven we do not need the same day authority, suspensions on special days, or the tolling of days for resolutions of inquiry and instructing conference committees. Speaker should relinquish these provisions for the good of the institution. For that reason, I urge the adoption of my amendment.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion or comments? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin,
Raskin is no.
We need to see you.
Sorry. I thought you had me. Can you see me now?
No.
There he is.
Okay,
Yes.
there we
Mr.
go.
Raskin,
Raskin is no.
Mr. Raskin, no. Miss Scanlon,
No.
Miss Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier,
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Miss Ross,
No.
Miss Roth, no. Mr. Neguse,
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Cole?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I have an amendment. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for the resolutions of inquiry. This is an issue we've talked about, obviously, over the last several weeks. It's unfortunate, I think, that the previous motions have been rejected. Hopefully, the majority recognizes that some of these provisions will, in fact, strengthen the institution as a whole and adopt them. For that reason, I once again am offering the motion to restore the use of resolutions of inquiry. Again, this control over House operations no longer seems to be about rapid response to COVID concerns, but rather the Speaker's concern over control of the floor in general. As we approach a 3-week recess, or the Democratic majority has begun calling them committee work weeks, continuing to hamstring a tool of the committees while they have the authority to act and work remotely during research, really, I think, only does disservice to the institution. So I would hope that we could make that change and allow ourselves to reclaim that power.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
Noes have it.
On that, Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier,
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse,
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
I have one last amendment, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee strike section amending HRes 188, which extends martial law. Mr. Chairman, I actually have a long statement here of an exact quote from you that I won't bother to read back to you because you'll be very familiar with
I'm
it.
sure it's very eloquent, though.
It is quite eloquent. Well, maybe I should go ahead and read it back to you and remind you of how eloquent you were in opposition to martial law that lasted for 3 days, as opposed to now well over a year. And I think the outrage just brims forward with great vim and verve. But again, I'll spare you quoting your own words at you. But it's been a long time. And I think inappropriate at this point to continue to operate under this. So I think some of the tension that we feel, certainly not all of it, is partly attributable to you have to let the institution, as I know you believe, breathe a little bit. And again, we have the ability to do that a little bit more now, and I think we're not exercising it. Certainly, I don't see the need for martial law under current circumstances. So with that, I almost made you speaker again, Mr. Chairman, because I think I'd do better under you. I really do. But regardless of that, I hope you'll consider the amendment and get rid of martial law.
Is there any discussion on the Cole amendment? I think I'll just point out for the record that in the majority, we call it same-day authority, not martial law. Anyway, I want to make that clear for the record.
You referred to it as martial law when you were in the minority.
Right. Well, no, I'm in the majority.
I thought the best thing to do would just be follow my chairman's example as closely as I can.
Anyway, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Share the
There
no.
wasn't much enthusiasm in that no, Mr. Chairman. So we'll be asking for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier,
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse,
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
I'll let you.
Ayes, 8 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule.
Burgess.
I move that the committee strike the section amending HRes 188 regarding the speaker's authority to schedule suspensions on special days. I think, Mr. Chairman, the House has shown over the past few months that we can handle a normal workload. Continuing the authority to schedule suspensions on special days stands as a reminder that the speaker's necessity of controlling tight grip on a very minuscule majority. In fact, last week, 22 bills were scheduled for the suspension calendar. There's no reason we need to continue to extend suspension authority in this manner. Mr. Chairman, I've written the speaker and I've written you. I think the science has shown Americans that we can get back to work. Last week, the CDC acknowledged that, and the people's house must lead by example. So I urge adoption of my motion. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Yeah, again, we brought up to the Rules Committee a bill that was just defeated on suspension for no good reason last week, and I don't see the big deal. I don't see why a process that's not offensive on a Monday is somehow offensive on a Tuesday. Sometimes well, whatever. But I would just also say too, as I said at the beginning here, the best way to get back to normal and full is to get everybody vaccinated. I mean, the science that the gentleman referred to has shown that vaccinations work. And yet for some reason, it has become politicized and it has become a radical idea. So let's get everybody vaccinated. And believe me, I want nothing better than to be in that Rules Committee room with all of you up close and personal. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
We're here. We'd invite you. We'd even let you sit in your normal chair again. We'd move Mr. Cole over and provide you a place to sit at the top of the dais.
But
the fact of the matter is, we all got vaccinated a long time ago.
Well,
in some ways, we jumped in line in front of average Americans. And then we're telling average Americans that we didn't really trust the vaccines because we won't behave normally. We need to show by example, lead by example. We've been vaccinated. Let's show the country that you can indeed return to normal if you take the vaccine.
Well, I would simply say to the gentleman, and I know he's been sending the message out to his constituents, and I appreciate that about the importance of vaccinations. He should also write to his Republican colleagues to make sure they all get vaccinated, because based on CNN's report, there's a big disparity here. And that is problematic. And that's what the scientists and the medical experts tell us.
Well, CNN is not the science.
Well, I mean, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo what you're saying, and you're making a really important point that's not a rhetorical point. When our distinguished colleague says that, that we were able to get vaccines before average Americans, I don't really accept the terminology. I'd hope we're average Americans too. I don't think we're above average. I don't think we're below average. I think we're average Americans. But in any event, I agree with him when he says we should lead by example. And leading by example is when it's your turn to get the vaccine, get the vaccine. And as the chairman's saying, 100% of the people in the majority have gotten the vaccine. And the numbers are like half of that on the minority side. So if we're gonna follow the science, let's start by following the science, by getting the vaccine, and then we can get back to work. But the idea of not getting the vaccine and pointing the finger at Chairman McGovern or Speaker Pelosi is just absurd. It's preposterous. So I would hope that the distinguished gentleman would go to his colleagues and urge all of them to get the vaccine and not to participate in whatever anti-scientific propaganda or undertow is out there. And then let's get Congress back to work, but at least spare us the lectures in the meantime. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. The vote now is on the.
Mr. Chairman, can I just say something very quickly?
Absolutely, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. I just want to assure you, I am not sitting in your place. Your chair is right here. I would never presume to sit where the chairman should sit. So just wanted to get that clear on the record. Didn't want you to have any offense, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'd be honored if you sat in my chair, to be honest with you. So
maybe someday, but the numbers will be different.
Yeah. All right. So now the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair that knows have it.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with Mr. Cole. That was half-hearted, and I'm going to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres, Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule.
Mr. Rushenthaler.
Reschenthaler.
Can't wait.
Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Yeah, can't wait. Well, before I get into it, I just want to welcome Joe to the committee and my own self-interest. I just see the chances of me getting invited to Colorado have gone up twofold. So I'm just going to have another member from Colorado. Looking forward to coming out. With that, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution. Mr. Chairman, once again, the House is abdicating our Article 1 authority. While you and I agree that the War Powers Resolution definitely needs reformed, closing off opportunities for all members on the fundamental issue of war is inappropriate. The House demonstrated it can handle a full legislative workload, even with proxy voting, and my amendment will not have a significant impact on the House's ability to operate on the floor. Mr. Chairman, the American people are returning to work, and we in Congress should do the same. So with that, I urge adoption of my motion. I yield back my time.
Yeah. I thank the gentleman for his amendment, and we are working to reform the War Powers Resolution. As somebody who has been very concerned about Congress abrogating its constitutional responsibilities, I take the gentleman's amendment very seriously. However, I would say that if the reason arose where it was appropriate to bring up the War Powers Resolution related item, believe me, I would move heaven and earth to do that, because I've seen what happens when Congress takes a back seat, and I'm working with Mr. Cole and others. But at this point, I would urge a no vote. And any other discussion on this amendment? Hearing none, the vote is on the Rushenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days. It's Clause 7C, Subdivision 1 of Rule 12, I believe it is. No, 22, excuse me, regarding instructing conference committees. Mr. Chair, I present to you another absurd authority the Speaker has imposed for no reason other than to maintain control over the House floor. Just like the resolutions of inquiry, this rule is intended to prevent tolling of days for members of the House to instruct members of a conference committee on the House floor. However, there are no concurrent conference committees in operation. This is a completely unnecessary lockdown that continues to disservice the institution. Ultimately, just because the Speaker can assert such authority at this time does not mean she should. After a year, let's look at finding ways to return to normalcy, and I urge the adoption of my amendment.
You heard the gentlelady's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, on that, we would request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli is aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross.
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess.
No.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler.
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach.
No.
Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and Ms. Scanlon will handle it for the majority.
And Mrs. Fishbach will handle it for the Republicans. But before we go, Mr. Chairman, I have something to present you we thought you would enjoy. This is a happy birthday cake for the first year of martial law. So we hope we only have to do this one time, but we thought we ought to mark the occasion.
Well, we all love dessert, so I
And
appreciate
it's actually a very good cake. Kelly did this cake, so. No, you didn't? No? Oh, well, it's good. Well, we only ordered the very best for our chairman, so we will personally deliver this to you.
Well, you guys have the first piece, and then I'll wait, and then I'll see whether I'm second.
Well, you can invite your other members up here and they could, if you need a taster, it doesn't need to be one of my guys. I only have 3.
All right, well, that is, without objection, the committee is adjourned.